with the secret of what New Orleans is talking about. I promise everything will be okay if you're listening here on the airwaves. It's that WBOK 12:30 a.m.
From the campus of Xavier University, WBOK 1230 AM, Go, an Equity Media Station.
We thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Mike Moore. Here's the latest from the Black Information Network. Former Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein is being indicted in New York City on new sex assault charges. Those charges are under seal. Prosecutors announced last week that they were presenting new allegations to a grand jury. In New York City, Alamo Drafthouse Cinema is dedicating a newly renovated Brooklyn theater to movie director African-American Spike Lee. The Brooklyn native was honored with a special celebration at the movie house Thursday night with a plaque bearing his name. More than 1 in 3 adults is obese in 23 states across the nation. Just over a decade ago, no state had an obesity rate that high. New data out this week from the CDC also found that at least 20% of adults in every state is obese. And that's the latest. I'm Mike Moore from your 24/7 news source, the Black Information Network and BINnews.com.
The following is a paid program and does not necessarily express the views or opinions of Equity Media, its management, staff, or affiliates of WBOK 1230.
Now, it's the Monitor's Mic with your host, Stella Cement.
Welcome to the Monitor's Mic, where we talk oversight, policing, and you. I'm Stella Cement, your host and the Independent Police Monitor for the City of New Orleans. And with me is Chriselle McGowan, our Deputy Police Monitor. This show is your go-to source for discussing policing, law enforcement oversight, and how it impacts you. We're here to inform and empower you by unraveling the complexities of policing, updating you on the consent decree, and engaging in conversations with leaders, oversight partners, district station captains, deputy chiefs, community organizations working on policing issues, and more. From the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, we offer an independent perspective on city government. The Office of the Independent Police Monitor, OIPM, serves as a crucial civilian oversight body for the New Orleans Police Department, the NOPD. We ensure transparency and accountability within the police department by making sure the NOPD follows their policies, abides by the consent decree, and is compliant with all local, state, and federal laws. Our office operates independently from the NOPD and the federal monitors, allowing us to provide an impartial perspective on police practices and investigations. What do we do day to day? We take complaints of officer misconduct from the public and from police officers. We review misconduct investigations conducted by the NOPD's Internal Affairs, which is called the Public Integrity Bureau. We're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days of the week, every day of the year for officer-involved shootings and critical incidents. We will go to the scene and monitor the force investigation from start to finish. We are advisory members of the Use of Force Review Board and disciplinary hearings. We run the Community Police Mediation Program, and we engage the community to ensure your voice, opinions, and concerns are heard. We, your hosts, are not police officers, but we are experienced lawyers from the criminal justice field, dedicated to transparency and accountability. We encourage you to call in today with your questions, comments, and concerns. While we may not be able to address individual cases, we are committed to following up with you. So with that, let's learn more about today's guest. Chriselle?
Good afternoon. This week we are joined with Professor William Snowden. From public defense in criminal district court to leading the Vera Institute to encouraging everyone to do their civil duty as the founder and director of the Juror Project, Professor Snowden has done it all. Professor Snowden joined the Loyola University New Orleans College of Law faculty in 2023 after being the Louisiana director of the Vera Institute of Justice. At the Vera Institute of Justice, Professor Snowden worked to advance justice reform across the state of Louisiana. While at the helm, Vera successfully worked to reduce the number of people held in local jails, advocated for data-driven reform, and partnered with people in the local New Orleans justice system, city leaders, and community organizations to complete relevant reports. These reports went on to shape legislation and local ordinances affecting New Orleanians. While at the Public Defender's Office, Professor Snowden was not scared to take a case to trial. While taking on the impossible task of balancing an overwhelming caseload, Professor Snowden won his client's freedom in front of juries in multiple courtrooms in criminal district court. Professor Snowden received the nation's Best Advocate Award from the National Bar Association and was recognized by the New Orleans Federal Bar Association as a Camille F. Gravel Public Service Awardee. Being a public defender is consuming work, but during this time at the Public Defender's Office, Professor Snowden also started a nonprofit. Professor Snowden is the founder and executive director of the Juror Project. The Juror Project seeks to increase civil engagement by informing and empowering you to serve on juries and making the jury experience more diverse and fairer. Now, Professor Snowden teaches in the areas of constitutional law, criminal law, and trial skills. With that, let's get started with Professor Snowden.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we just want to get started right away with the consent decree, if that's all right.
Sure.
So in March of this year, you wrote a letter to the judge, Judge Morgan, who's presiding over the consent decree in New Orleans. Can you describe to our listeners what the contents of that letter was?
Yes, so many members of the New Orleans community were asking me whether or not the newly announced Troop NOLA, which is a division of the Louisiana State Troopers, whether or not they would have to comply with the New Orleans Police Department's consent decree. I did not know the answer, and so I simply wrote a letter to the judge to get clarity on whether or not the Louisiana State Troopers, Troop NOLA, would have to mirror the requirements of the consent decree as applied to NOPD. The judge responded, not directly to me in the letter, but at the next consent decree hearing, she said on the record that she had received a letter. She didn't name me by name or anything, but she said she had received a letter with this inquiry, and she answered that the Louisiana State Troopers policing in the city of New Orleans do not have to comply with the New Orleans Police Department consent decree because they themselves are a separate policing entity. She did say, however, they do need to abide by the Louisiana and federal constitutions as it relates to the governing elements providing guidelines for what policing should look like.
That's very interesting. And I just want to add to that the reason why this is such an open question, or was such an open question, is that there's paragraph 8 of the consent decree, which requires that all bodies within the city of New Orleans, so all agencies or contractors or agents of the city of New Orleans, are bound by the consent decree, and they have to follow the consent decree. And the question was, well, what does that make Troop NOLA? Mm-hmm. Will Troop NOLA have to follow by the consent decree? Are they acting as an agent of the city since they're going to be taking on a policing capacity here? And the judge responded to you, no.
Right. And I think that it's very creative in terms of how the Louisiana State Troopers ensured that they would not have to comply with the consent decree as it relates to there not being a cooperative endeavor agreement or a contract or a memorandum of understanding. As you mentioned, if you are deemed to be kind of like a sub-agency of NOPD, then you got to comply with the consent decree. I did submit a public record request to the city of New Orleans as well as Louisiana State Troopers to simply say or request what agreement, if any, exists between these two entities. I did not, Louisiana State Troopers said no such agreement exists. The city of New Orleans responded to my public record request, giving me the previous MOUs or CEAs, memorandums of understandings or cooperative endeavor agreements, I think going back to maybe 2018, to demonstrate that previously when the Louisiana State Troopers were in fact policing in New Orleans, there was an agreement between the two. And I think that agreement does a variety of things. One, it creates clarity and understanding between the agencies who is supposed to be doing what. Two, it can be a public-facing document for the community to understand what will be the Louisiana State Troopers' responsibilities, where will they be policing, what are the expectations and requirements of them. And thirdly, it serves as a document of accountability, that if either of the entities go beyond the means of that agreement, then there's an opportunity to hold them accountable for violating that MOU or that CEA. In this instance, with the creation of Troop NOLA, which was kind of promulgated or put forth and interested with Governor Jeff Landry, there is no such agreement. And I do know that the governor has, been on record being very critical of the consent decree. I think his frustrations are represented as the consent decree kind of hamstringing the New Orleans Police Department, and just being very mindful that if the Louisiana State Troopers would have to also comply with the consent decree, that it would hamstring those state troopers that are being in the city of policing in the city of New Orleans. And so, here we have a consent decree which can represent both legal expectations of the New Orleans Police Department, but also an articulation of what New Orleanians expect policing to look like in our city. And we have a policing agency like Troop NOLA that does not have to abide by those expectations.
And that's a really strong message to send to the community, isn't it?
It is. I think if we think about concerns about Louisiana State Troopers at large, a lot of individuals who are asking me if Troop NOLA has to abide by the consent decree, they had the reputation of the Louisiana State Troopers in mind, and how previous times when Louisiana State Troopers were policing in New Orleans, they were known to be much more aggressive than the New Orleans Police Department. They were also having a reputation of understanding what happened in, I believe it was Union Parish with Robert Greene. And a lot of things were top of mind for New Orleanians by having this additional policing agency in our city. And the concerns that they were representing was to make sure that the policing that Troop NOLA was going to be executing in our city was constitutional, but also was rooted in keeping all New Orleanians safe.
Well said. Thank you for explaining that. So while we're on the topic of the consent decree, you obviously have held a lot of different roles in this city, and you've gotten to have a vast perspective on the criminal justice system here. So drawing on that perspective, in your opinion, do you think NOPD is ready to exit the consent decree?
I think NOPD has certainly made improvements. It's hard for me to say whether or not I think they're ready to exit the consent decree because I haven't been following it as detailed as some other folks like yourselves had. I will say, knowing the progress that has been made, top of mind is how do we sustain that progress? And it makes me think of a constitutional case that some folks are familiar with called Shelby County versus Eric Holder. And this was a case challenging a portion of the Voting Rights Act, specifically Section 5, which requires southern states and other states that have historically participated in preventing people from having access to the polls, historically Black Americans, preventing access to the ballot box, whether it was through things like poll taxes or literacy tests or other forms of intimidation, that if any of these states who have had a history of voter discrimination, if they wanted to change their voting laws, they had to get what was called preclearance, which basically was a process which required these states to present their change in policy to the federal judges in Washington, D.C., and basically the federal judges had to approve or deny that particular change. In Shelby County versus Eric Holder, the state of Alabama was arguing, look, we understand when the Voting Rights Act was put into place, we did have these practices of discrimination, but look how far we have come. A concern when this legislation was passed in the 60s was that we didn't have a lot of Black people registered to vote. We didn't have Black elected officials. We did have things that kept Black people from the ballot box. But look where we are today. We have just about the same amount of people per capita registered to vote. We have Black elected officials. Look at all this progress that we have made. Therefore, we don't need to go through this pre-clearance process because we're a new Alabama, right? In that decision, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg writes in her dissent, you don't give praise to an umbrella for keeping you dry during a rainstorm and then throw out the umbrella while it's still raining. And I think when we're having a conversation about whether or not the New Orleans Police Department is prepared and ready to, be no longer under the consent decree, we have to consider, are we throwing out the umbrella? Has the consent decree done its job in terms of facilitating a improved New Orleans Police Department? And are they positioned to maintain and sustain that progress, or is it too soon? And so those are the questions that I think we should be asking to determine whether or not the consent decree has been satisfied by the New Orleans Police Department. And we certainly have to incorporate the voice of community in answering that question.
That is a fantastic perspective. Thank you so much, Professor. And I just want to add on that one of the reasons why I think that is a fantastic perspective is that we don't have a lot of jurisprudence right now in the area of consent decrees that have to do with policing. We know that that there was a bill passed in 1994 which enabled the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to be able to enter into these unique federal consent decrees with municipalities and specifically law enforcement to address patterns and practices of problematic policing. And since then, we've seen a lot of cities enter consent decrees, but we haven't seen a lot of cities exit them. And for that reason, we really don't have a strong legal road to walk down to say that this in court is what is persuasive for what the end of a consent decree should look like legally. And I think your example is really powerful because it reminds us to look outside of consent decrees and to look to other similarly situated federal statutes or federal consent decrees and agreements and look to how those decisions are made. Because I do think that example, and particularly the language around throwing out our umbrella, is very valuable for the situation we're in now, especially one where we started this conversation talking about Troop NOLA. We started this conversation talking about the state's perspective on the consent decree and how that might differ from our city's perspective on the consent decree. And that's an important political reality to hold in our mind as we embark on this conversation about what the end, potentially, of the consent decree could look like here. So thank you so much for that point. And I do want to ask, do you think the consent decree has impacted the relationship between the police and the community here in New Orleans?
I think it has. I think there has been a document that the community has been able to point to say, hey, this is what is required of y'all. And having that as a reference point has given some sustenance to what community has raised in terms of their concerns. I'm also mindful of policing practices that have changed, at least under my experience when I was a public defender. We used to call them dropsy cases. And what a dropsy case essentially is officers would write in their report that when we were riding down the streets, we saw people taking drugs out of their pockets and dropping them onto the ground.
Right.
And that kind of facilitated the probable cause or the reasonable and articulable suspicion to stop and pat that person down and then charge them with the possession of drugs. When the New Orleans Police Department began being required to wear body cameras, somehow, some way, those dropsy cases just disappeared.
Isn't that funny? As a former public defender who practiced alongside you, I can also attest to that. It was very interesting that we went from a department that had fantastic eyesight. They were able to see an individual dropping a single rock of cocaine, like a single crack rock, from blocks away. They were able to see this perfectly, and they were able to identify that one crack rock on a street covered in rubble and gravel so quickly. And all of a sudden that did seem to disappear after the introduction of body-worn camera.
And I think what facilitated some of that disappearance was the notion that we all act differently when we know we're being watched.
That's true.
Right. And how body cameras have facilitated a level of transparency that officers didn't necessarily have to take account for previously. Now, I have had conversations with officers who have said, look, previously, if I were to interact with somebody who had, one crack rock on them, right, I could give them a verbal warning and I could say, like, don't do this or go get help or whatever it might be. And this officer has said, now I can't do that because everything is recorded on body camera. I'm not able to use that particular discretion. I don't know if this officer's recount is what majority of officers do when they're required to wear body cameras. But I do want to lift up the fact that, yes, we can highlight the notion that when people are being watched, they act differently. But also, on the other side, police officers have indicated this over sense of surveillance on them takes away some of their discretion that they would argue was being used for good.
That's a really good perspective on both sides of that. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that we're going to take a break now, and when we return, we're going to talk a little about your background and how you got into the criminal justice space.
Great.
Norman Robinson is back,
Can you hear me now?
and he's taking no prisoners.
Can you hear me now?
Each weekday, Norman Robinson brings you commentary with Off the Top.
The incident was shocking, disturbing, disgusting, disappointing, and sad.
Each weekday, Off the Top with Norman Robinson is heard exclusively right here.
It's Off the Top with Norman Robinson on WBOK 1230 AM.
Welcome back to the Monitor's Mic, and today we're joined by Professor William Snowden. Thank you again for being with us today. So, Professor Snowden, let's talk a little bit about your background in the criminal legal field. So, you've been a public defender and an executive director of Vera Institute, and you're now a law professor. So, what inspires you to work in these criminal justice spaces?
I'm reminded of a reality that if you're not doing something, you're doing nothing. And that sounds very basic and simple. But as I am continually reminded of how our criminal legal system works, I try to describe my work as creating a justice system that is worthy of its name. And you will know that a lot of people, myself included, have shifted our terminology from saying criminal justice system to criminal legal system, and that's because from our perspective and our experiences within this system, the system lacks justice. And so it is a criminal legal system. It is not necessarily a criminal justice system, but that doesn't mean that it can't be true to its name. So I think what has gotten me into this work is recognizing that our system is working in ways that are ripe for improvement. And so my involvement in these different spaces, again, is on a quest to create a justice system that is worthy of its name.
And I 100% agree with that. In my last couple of years of working at Innocence Project New Orleans, I also switched from terminology of the justice system to the legal system because we recognize it as what it is, but we do believe that one day that we can actually call it a justice system, and hopefully that comes to fruition. So you also once told a story about your time on the cross-country running team in high school and how that colored your perspective on policing. So would you share that story with our listeners now?
Certainly. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I went to a high school in the suburbs of Milwaukee. The high school that I went to was called Wauwatosa West. And
Wauwatosa?
Wauwatosa.
Wauwatosa.
Yeah, it's a Native American name. My freshman year, which would have been 1999, I had the idea to join the cross-country team. And that particular summer, I'll admit I was the slowest person on the team. And we were running cross-country practice in kind of a more affluent suburb of Milwaukee called Brookfield. And as I'm running on this particular day, the rest of the cross-country team was about a mile ahead of me. And I'm running by myself. A police officer pulls up, and he rings his siren one time, and he says, "Why are you running so fast?" And I have to laugh because I know I'm actually not running that fast because the rest of the team is, a mile ahead of me. But my first answer was actually nonverbal. I look at the ridiculously short shorts that I was wearing that no self-respecting person wears unless you're running cross-country practice. I also looked at the shirt that I was wearing that had 2 letter C's on it with an arrow through it, which is a universal symbol for cross country. And then I told the officer I'm running cross country practice. He said, likely story. He then asked me for my ID, and those short shorts did not have any pockets. So I didn't have an ID to give him, but I gave him my name and my date of birth, and he ran my information, and of course nothing pops up. I get back to the high school eventually, and I tell my coach what happened, and I get home and I tell my parents what happened, and my parents were upset. My mom and dad get in the minivan, and my sister gets in the minivan, and I come from a blended background, so my dad is black and my mom is white. We drive out to Brookfield and go into the police station, and my dad begins yelling at the officer who's at the desk. My mom begins yelling at the officer who's at the desk, and then the officer says, "Sir, we'll be with you in a second. Ma'am, how can we help you?" Not realizing we were, in fact, a family unit. Given all the commotion that my parents were making in the lobby, a higher-ranking officer, a lieutenant or something, comes out and basically wants to interview me. And my parents in that moment decided it'd be best for my mom to go with me to be interviewed by this officer. And that is just navigating the understanding that my mom, as a white woman, would be able to challenge the authority of this officer in a way that my dad wouldn't necessarily have to navigate the tone of his voice, the volume of his voice, the intimidation that may be perceived when he is back there, if he were to come back there with me. So as the officer or the lieutenant is asking me questions, one of the first questions they asked was, "What direction were you running?" And I told them I was running towards west. And everybody in that area knows there's 2 main high schools. One is Wauwatosa West, the other is Wauwatosa East. Nobody says Wauwatosa because it's a mouthful. And so the high schools are simply referred to west or east. And he questioned my nautical direction because he says, "Well, the street you claim you were stopped on runs north and south, not east and west." And my mom quickly says, "Well, you know he's talking about running towards Wauwatosa West High School." The officer then said something that made me upset. He said, "Well, we have a witness that saw the cop not stop and talk to you." And without skipping a beat, my mom said, "Well, how did you canvass for that? Did you go around knocking on doors, asking people, did you see this cop not stop and talk to this young black kid? And then when did you canvass for that? Because we just got here 5 minutes ago." Right. My mom then does something that kind of threw me for a loop. She took out her checkbook. And, we don't come from money. Both my parents were Milwaukee public school teachers. But you'll remember in 1999, we didn't have smartphones with calendars. But at the top of a checkbook is a calendar. And my mom takes out her pen and she says, if we don't get a written apology by, and she says, Friday, August 17th, you'll see this story in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel on Monday. And it was a valid threat because my mom, there was a person at my church who worked for the paper. And I was like, yeah, my mom probably could get this story placed, right? And the officer did not give us a written apology. And I think my mom wanted one because she's an English teacher. Mm-hmm. And she, likes the respect for the written word. But we did get a verbal apology. And, we ended up leaving. I share that story as an example of a couple of things, right? As a black person running in a suburb of Milwaukee, when this Brookfield officer saw me, he didn't see an athlete. He didn't see the slowest kid on the cross-country team, right? He saw a young black boy in a predominantly white, affluent neighborhood who didn't belong there. And it reminds me of this reality that sometimes, the way we see each other is the way we treat each other. And this officer treated me as if I potentially was somebody committing a crime. I also know that that is a reality for a lot of black people and people of color in this country, that when we are viewed by law enforcement, they don't assume that we are doing something innocent. Sometimes the assumption is that we are up to something criminal. But I also share this story because I had the tremendous value of having 2 amazing parents who, when they saw or learned of their kids experiencing injustice, they spoke up about it and they did something about it. And I think about the value of having both my mother and my father in my corner, challenging this authority that I would have no idea how to challenge myself. And And I think about how I can replicate that as a person who was a public defender, who now still takes a couple cases from the public defender's office, being a champion in somebody's corner, particularly a person that is often viewed in the courtroom as being the least popular person, being charged with something that is probably one of the worst things they've ever done, as Brian Stevenson says. But the value of having advocacy, I think, brings legitimacy to our criminal legal system.
That's amazing, and I mean, it's really telling, especially when you consider everything that you just said, especially from your literally what you had on and the activity that you were doing. It seems like it's obvious, right? But unfortunately, they only saw a black kid running in an affluent neighborhood.
That's right. I think about what that looks like as an adult. I'm not the most stylish person, but when I got to go to court, I'll put on a suit, and I think I quote unquote look like a lawyer. And since I was a public defender, even to this day, there will be times when I'm in court and deputies will ask me, what's your name for the docket, right? And I'm not a criminal defendant. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, right? And even in 2024, the perception that often people have of people of color, black people particularly, in a courtroom, you can only be there for one reason, and that's because you're on the docket, not because you're representing somebody on the docket. So I'm constantly reminded of that reality, of the spaces that we have to navigate. And that experience isn't unique to me, right? It's I know that a lot of black lawyers experience that. I know a lot of women lawyers experience that. I know a lot of people of color lawyers experience that. And it's just a reminder of not only the work we have to do to improve our criminal legal system from a legal structure perspective, but also the culture of what the administration of a criminal legal system looks like.
And I tell people that all the time, and they seem to still be shocked that it's still happening. But I always say, yeah, when I walk in a courtroom, I'm usually either the defendant, someone's mother, someone's sister, or family member. I'm never the lawyer, never. So that definitely does resonate. So let's go back to you being on the independent public defender's office in Orleans Parish. While you were there, though, you started a nonprofit called the Juror Project. So what exactly is the Juror Project?
The Juror Project is my effort to increase the diversity of our jury panels and improve the fairness of our criminal legal system. And so what I mean is our criminal juries often do not represent the community in which those trials are taking place. And they don't represent the communities where the trials are taking place for a variety of reasons. I've identified 5. So the first is what we describe as felony disenfranchisement. So there are more than 25 states, I believe, that permanently disenfranchise people with felony convictions from serving on a jury. If we zoom back and we think about the overrepresentation of black people in the criminal legal system with felony convictions, we know that is one element of how black people are being removed from that jury box. But also more broadly, we think about people with felony convictions of any identity not being allowed to have access to that jury box. The second contributing factor is the summonsing process. So the lists that we are using to summon jurors are not fully capturing the eligible juror population. So
I'm sorry, can you just really quick, summonsing?
Yes.
Yeah, can you explain what that means,
Yeah,
just for
thank
anyone
you.
who's not familiar with that word?
Yeah, so when a court is trying to assemble its jurors, it will mail out summonses, which are paper notices that you are being requested to come to court for the purpose of serving on a jury. The lists that are typically used in jurisdictions to issue those summons or to get the names and addresses to summon individuals are usually DMV records and voter registration lists. So in Orleans Parish, we use those two lists, and a preliminary analysis has revealed that when we only use those two lists, we are effectively excluding about 35% of people who otherwise would be eligible to serve on a jury, but since they don't have an active driver's license or they're not registered to vote, they're simply not being summoned. So we should question, is the jury that is being summoned an actual representation of a jury of one's peers? The third contributing factor is the voir dire practice, the voir dire process. And voir dire is this Latin term to describe jury selection, which is the conversation between the lawyers and the potential jurors. And the voir dire process can be an avenue for juror discrimination based on the types of questions that are being asked. While I was a public defender, my experience was a lot of prosecutors would ask a question to New Orleanians: how many of us have had a bad experience with the New Orleans Police Department? Inevitably, majority of the black people on the jury would raise their hand. They'd talk about that bad experience, and then prosecutors would use the articulation of that bad experience to say this juror is biased against New Orleans Police Department, and they would strike that juror from the jury box.
What does strike mean?
Strike means removing them from the panel of being an eligible person to participate on the jury. And there's two ways in which a juror or a potential juror can be struck from the jury. One is called a peremptory strike. The other is called a legal cause strike. And so these are the mechanisms that lawyers have at their availability to kind of curate who are the 12 people that are going to be sitting on the jury if it's a 12-person jury. Sometimes we have we have 6-person juries as well. The fourth contributing factor is community mindset. Excuse me. And I would invite listeners to take out their cell phones, or if they're near a laptop, to open up Google and do a quick search. And I invite you to type in 5 words. The first word is how. The second word is to, T-O. The third word is get. The fourth word is out. And the fifth word is up. Ms. Chriselle, what you got over there?
How to get out of a jury?
Right? So we take this empirical study that Google is giving us in terms of this data. It demonstrates that majority of Americans are researching how to get out of jury service. And this is ranking higher than Americans researching how to get out of debt or how to get out of depression. Let me be somebody to tell you that jury service is not that bad, right?
And
we
it's
need
needed.
It's needed, and we need to change our mindset of the importance of jury duty. So that's the fourth contributing factor, right? Community mindset. The fifth contributing factor is juror pay. There are literally people who cannot afford to miss work and serve on a jury. And we think about how that is removing certain members of different socioeconomic statuses. It curates a jury that might be more affluent, or a jury that has people working salary jobs as opposed to hourly jobs. And all those things are curating who is actually going to be on the jury.
It might be an older population who are retired, who can
Exactly.
serve on a jury.
Exactly.
And that can change their perspective. I mean, if you look at different age factors, it could change their perspective on the defendant. And
That's right.
There's
So
a lot of things there.
a lot of things, and we should recognize that the law doesn't really define who is a peer. And my suggestion is that we need to be curating juries of peers based on 4 different factors, or 4 different variables. One variable is age. Another variable is gender. A third variable is race. And a fourth variable is perspective. And I think if we can take a community's demographics as it relates to age, race, and gender, and then get into this idea of perspective, which I acknowledge is a little bit more difficult to ascertain, we can actually curate what the Sixth Amendment requires, which is a jury of one's peers, but more importantly, a effective or an essential component of a jury of one's peers is what they call a fair cross-section. There's a United States Supreme Court case called Taylor versus Louisiana, which entitles a person going to trial to have a fair cross-section of their community. So if we recognize that our voir dire process, our summonsing process, our felony disenfranchisement, our community mindset, our lack of juror pay, if we recognize that that is actually removing certain peers from the jurisdiction, what is the government doing to counter that, or to ensure we actually do have a jury of one's peers? And so the Juror Project does 2 things. One, it proposes solutions to those 5 contributing factors, removing jurors from the jury box that are essential peers to the person who is accused of a crime. But also we're trying to promote this novel and crazy idea that the government actually has an affirmative obligation to provide a jury of one's peers, meaning that the 12 people that are sitting in that box actually match, to some degree of variability, the demographics of the actual jurisdiction. This fourth variable, as relates to perspective, what I'm getting at is we currently have a system that allows more frequently pro-prosecution perspectives to make it on a jury as opposed to pro-defense perspectives. So what I mean is, if you have somebody on the jury, and I had this experience where an older black man said, we were going to trial, I was representing somebody who was charged with possessing 2 crack rocks and 3 pills that he did not have a prescription for. And there was an older black gentleman who said, Mr. Snowden, I don't think I can vote guilty for your guy because it sounds like he has a drug problem and needs help, not incarceration. And when he said that, my baby public defender heart smiled because I knew that was exactly the type of diverse peer the person I had the privilege of representing needed on the jury. And then there were about 4 to 5 other black and white people who essentially said the same thing, that they did not believe in utilizing our system of incarceration to punish people who are clearly having a substance use issue. And after those individuals made those statements, I sat down, the prosecutor stood up, and he struck and removed all 5 of those jurors from the jury. And that was when the moment my client leaned over to me and said, "What happened to all my people?" And when he said that, he wasn't just talking about the black people on the jury. He was talking about the black and white peers that understood he had a drug problem and needed help, not incarceration. So when I think about how our system facilitates pro-prosecution jurors making it onto the jury as opposed to pro-defense jurors making it on the jury, I argue that's contrary to what the Sixth Amendment requires. We are familiar with this phrase that you have a right to a fair and impartial jury. An impartial jury is curated by all 12 jurors. So if we have somebody on the jury who believes that we should not be sending people to prison for a simple possession of crack cocaine and pills, just as much as we have somebody on the jury who does believe that, if we are able to facilitate that spectrum and difference of perspectives, and that jury comes to a verdict, we as a community can have more faith in the integrity of that verdict because we have this impartiality that is secured by residents and members of the community that differ, right? Their perspectives differ from each other, but they were able to come to an agreement. That's what our jury system is about. It's about having a representative portion of your community sitting in judgment of another person to decide whether or not or how this person should be held accountable for allegedly committing a crime. But when we have a system that removes certain mindsets and allows certain mindsets to make it on the jury, we are actually diminishing the integrity and the validity of that conviction. And that concerns me as it relates to how we are ensuring we have fairness in our criminal legal system. The research is very clear when it comes to group decision-making processes. When you have more diverse juries, you have longer deliberations. Deliberations is the term that we use to describe jurors having a conversation after the case has been presented, and they're asking each other questions and reviewing the evidence. So the research demonstrates you have longer deliberations. A more objective decision is going to be made, meaning that a conviction is not going to be sustained or an acquittal is not going to be sustained purely on subjective beliefs, right? Thirdly, we know that more implicit biases are going to be countered. And again, or not again, but implicit bias is our brain's instant and automatic association of stereotypes that's happening at the unconscious level of our brains. And fourth, more questions are going to be addressed in the deliberation room. So when we're thinking about how to improve the fairness of our criminal legal system, particularly as it relates to people who are going to trial, the role that diversity can play is huge, and the research supports that. So that's why I'm committed with the Juror Project to really be laser focused, not only on what the problems are contributing to removing diverse peers from our jury, but also the policies that we can be putting forth to ensure a person going to trial does have a diverse jury so they can actually have full realization of what the Sixth Amendment requires.
So I have to say I completely agree with all of those goals. But for the sake of understanding the other side, if they were to argue, what do you mean the government has an affirmative obligation to create this cross-section jury when don't they have an affirmative obligation to represent the people and to get a conviction? Mm-hmm. How are they supposed to hold both of those duties simultaneously when they carry the burden of proof? And this is their case. They're supposed to be, keeping us safe and prosecuting the people that supposedly committed crime. Mm-hmm. How do they do that and have and ensure a diverse jury? Wouldn't that be against their interests?
So I would say that the government can be represented in 2 different ways in the criminal courtroom. When we think about the courtroom work group, we have defense attorneys, we have prosecutors, and we have judges. The things that you were lifting up, I would say, are obligations of the prosecution, right? The notion that prosecutors' jobs are to promote public safety and hold people accountable, they can keep that charge, right? I'm talking about what it can be the role of the courts. in providing this affirmative obligation that the jury actually is reflective of the community. And they have tremendous power in terms of deciding what types of strikes they are going to be granting. Each party, the defense and the prosecution, have tools to remove jurors and kind of curate the jury to represent the community. And I will remind folks that it is only the accused person on trial that has a right to a jury of their peers, not necessarily the government. And although we allow the government to have, the prosecution to have peremptory strikes, that is purely a Sixth Amendment right applied to the accused person. But I don't think there is anything compromising if we have the judge who is facilitating that jury selection process to be the decider of whether or not the jury that has been provided is in fact a diverse peers. And so when we think about the government here, yes, there's a role of the prosecution, but I'm talking more about the administration of the jury process. So the clerk of court who is administering all the different lists, the judge who is presiding over the actual jury selection process, they represent the government as well. And from an administrative perspective, their interests are to ensure that jury is fair, it is impartial, and it's a fair cross-section of the community. We don't need to include the prosecutor in that analysis. Their charge is to seek justice, not to secure convictions, but to seek justice. And theoretically, they should be very supportive of the requirement and the establishment of an actual diverse set of peers for the trial, because that supports the integrity of their convictions. We think about in Orleans Parish and its reputation of having many people being exonerated that were convicted in this city. If we recognize that our system is not working the way that we think it should be working in holding innocent people and sending them to prison for crimes they did not commit, prosecutors should be very interested in how we are both increasing the validity and accuracy of verdicts, but also how we are giving more integrity to their convictions so that we don't have to have something like a civil rights division in our prosecutor's office that has to review past or previous convictions underneath the umbrella that there might have been some prosecutorial misconduct that secured those convictions. So the affirmative obligation that I am talking about is not necessarily within the responsibility of the prosecutors, more so with the clerk of court, with the judge, those who are administering the actual process of jury selection and jury service.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And we're going to take a break again, and when we come back, we'll have more of this discussion. Thank you.
Hey y'all, it's Chef Bunny, and I'm the host of The Roo, where we will be discussing all things food and NOLA. You can catch me live on air Thursdays at 12:30 p.m., so check out what we'll be cooking up on WBOK 1230 AM.
Late nights are made for chillin', and you can do just that every Sunday night at 10 p.m. as DJ Wick brings you The Love Zone. It's the perfect way to top off your weekend with your favorite old and new school ballads. So sit back, relax, and let DJ Wick take you to the on WBOK 1230 AM and on the World Wide Web at WBOK1230.com.
Hi, and we're back at the Monitor's Mic, and we're joined today with Professor William Snowden. Thank you so much for coming in. We just had a very interesting breakdown of our jury system, and I loved hearing your vision on how to make the jury system better. So before we go into our next set of questions, the Juror Project is a fantastic organization. If there's a listener out there who wants to get more involved in the Juror Project, wants more information about the Juror Project, or wants to donate, is there somewhere they should go, something they should do?
Yeah, there's three things that come to mind. One is to attend a Juror Project workshop where we explore all of these concepts in much more in depth. Our website is www.thejurorproject.org. And if you're on Instagram, the handle is @JurorProject. The second thing that you can get involved with is book us for a workshop, right? We give presentations all around the country. We have some lined up in Washington, D.C., in Milwaukee, in Minneapolis. So we're happy to come and bring this work to your jurisdiction. And then lastly, we do have a donate button, right? We are a nonprofit. We are growing. We are building. And your financial support helps us expand the work that we're doing. And that donate button is on the website. It's a red button to catch your eye.
Awesome. All right. So please, if you feel inspired, if you're listening today, you like what you're hearing, donate, 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 and respond to your summons to serve on a jury and do your civic duty, please. So, Professor, now that you are a professor, how do you balance your role as an educator with this advocacy work that you're doing in the criminal legal system?
So I teach constitutional law, criminal procedure, and a lot of my teaching is not only informed by the case books that I utilize, but also my experience as a practicing lawyer. I still do practice. I take 3 cases from the public defender's office, which sounds so small compared to what my 180 caseload was when I was a public defender. But it keeps me grounded and connected to the issues that are percolating within our criminal legal system. And I think my students appreciate being able to provide real-world examples that can help illuminate more of the concepts that we're reading about in the text. And so it's just a real privilege and joy to be able to cover certain cases that have been assigned for reading and then say, hey, this is what it looks like in the real world. You know, here goes an example of a case that I had. And I think connecting those dots between perhaps the theory of law and the practice of law is something that my students appreciate.
I always appreciate it when my professors actually were professors that were actually working in the field that they were teaching. Mm-hmm. It seemed like, like you said, more real world examples. A lot of times, you got these antiquated cases that you're studying and you understand it, but it's not really landing and hitting home for you. So I know they most likely definitely appreciate the fact that you can bring this real world experiences to them.
Absolutely.
And so what do you hope students would take away from your course or take away from that experience of hearing about these cases that you're handling?
I hope they take away an understanding of the power that they have, right? I am just one lawyer, and I get to highlight for them the impact that I have, on a singular basis for one person that I might have the privilege of representing, and to never discount the impact that they can have on a system, from my perspective, that is not doing what we need it to do, which is to simultaneously promote public safety and a system of accountability, but is really inadequately positioned to do so when we know that our criminal legal system often inherits the disparities of these other systems, right? I talk about the criminal legal system as being the catch basin for the failures of our other systems. Wow. So if we want to improve our criminal legal system, let's talk about how we improve access to quality education, access to fair housing, access to jobs. Because when we know when those systems succeed and people are able to be in positions of being able to thrive, fewer people have contact with the criminal legal system, right? It's so easy for us to focus on the quote-unquote problem in front of us, which is often inaccurately labeled as people and individuals, and it's more difficult for us to focus on the problems that are creating the problems in front of us, which are failed systems. We can indict an individual. We cannot necessarily indict a system. And when I'm teaching and having conversations with my students, I want them to understand the ability to both oscillate from the analogy being like you can be on the dance floor and you can be on the balcony, right? When you're on the dance floor, you're representing individual people, or if students are becoming prosecutors, or they're advocating on behalf of survivors of crime. But when you're on the balcony, you can actually get a more 10,000-foot perspective to see how are all these players working together. Who's dancing by the DJ? Who's at the punch bowl, right? I'm dating myself because I don't even know if dances I can't have a punch bowl anymore, right? But just thinking about how we are zooming out to look at the system and how it works with others. So my students, they ask all the right questions. They bring such a joyous amount of energy and curiosity. It's a real privilege to influence this next generation of lawyers.
And it kind of reminds me of when people say, you have to try to figure out how to solve the lake problems and not the fish problems. Mm-hmm. So to take the bigger overview of everything that's going on and not just fix these little bitty things, because it's not going to solve the full thing that's happening. So I liked how you use the balcony and dance floor where you can actually see a full perspective of everything that's going on.
Can I explain that lake fish analogy real quick?
I think I learned that from you.
That's awesome if you did. I mean, it's not original to me. I learned it from the People's Institute.
Yes, that's where it was.
So the idea is if you're driving down a road and you were to see a dead fish in a lake, you might think, oh, something's wrong with that fish. But if you were to drive past that same lake, down that same road, and you saw 1,000 fish belly up, dead in the water, you would say something's wrong with the water. And that is just an analogy to think about how are we focusing on systems that are producing these individuals that are the fish. And we don't always take that perspective to have that systems analysis because it's not easily digestible, right? It seems like to change a system, there have to be so many different gears that are moving at the same time to have any change. But to hold an individual accountable, that's a lot easier to do. And I think when we think about the impact of crime and incidents of violence and what that has on our communities, people want to see an individual held accountable. They don't want to see a system held accountable. And I don't want listeners to think that I don't believe in individual accountability. I strongly believe in individual accountability. I am just not persuaded that our current approach to holding individuals accountable is actually promoting public safety. Right? Louisiana has had the highest incarceration rate in the country for decades. And if incarceration actually promoted public safety, we'd be one of the safest states in the country, but we're not. And so we have to really question, do we want to accept this inheritance of the criminal legal system as it is currently designed, or do we want to perhaps learn from the things that are not working well and propose new ideas and envision different ways of holding people accountable, because locking people up, it just hasn't been working, right? And we deserve, and our elected leaders really owe us to think more creatively in how we can promote accountability, we can promote, people's ability to thrive in our communities, and not just lazily try to lock our way out of problems that aren't actually, incidents of violence or problematic people. We have to be understanding the role that these failed systems are playing as well.
That is a very powerful point, and I think we should go out on that one. But first, I want to quickly say, you brought up the People's Institute. That's the People's Institute, and that's the Undoing Racism training.
That's right.
So for any of our listeners who are wondering about that, because that is a fantastic metaphor, and it really does capture what's happening.
It's great training as well.
It's great training. I want to make sure that people understand that's the People's Institute Undoing Racism training. And we do highly recommend it for anyone who's listening. So thank you again for coming on our show. You have given us a lot of wonderful thoughts, and I truly hope anyone listening does do their duty and serve on a jury.
That's right.
And with that, Chriselle, will you see us out?
So that wraps up today's episode of The Monitor's Mic, and I want to always extend a heartfelt thank you to all our listeners for tuning in and staying engaged with the crucial conversations we're having about police oversight and community safety. I also want to invite the community to please join us on Tuesday, September 17th at 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. for a public forum with Superintendent Annie Kirkpatrick at Joe Brown Gymnasium in the East. Food will be served, and of course, kids are welcomed. And a special thank you again to our guest, Professor Snowden, for the invaluable insights that you have shared making today's show possible. If you missed any of today's episode or any other episodes, please visit us on our website at www.nolaipm.gov, and you can follow us on YouTube at NOLA IPM. And you can also follow us on social media for updates and news on Instagram at NOLA OIPM and on Facebook at New Orleans Independent Police Monitor. Until next time, stay informed, stay involved, stay committed to building a safer community. I'm Chriselle McGowan with Stella Cement, and this has been The Monitor's Mic.